we do always acknowledge that we meet, or in this case, convene our Zoom meetings on Musqueam traditional, ancestral, and crucially unceded territory. The Musqueam are ultimately our hosts. So we hope these sessions appropriately recognize them and convey our thanks for that. This session in particular, it's important that that this kind of acknowledgement, and Alex's welcome is especially important for it. It's been collaborative, it's been a partnership from the beginning between researchers and Musqueam. It's been long in the making. It was postponed from last March when it was scheduled as one of the last sessions of an Indigenous science series that was hosted by Green College. It was a cross-sectoral series last year that ran all last year. Those sessions, I think almost all of them have been recorded and they're available online. We'll put a note up, put the link up in the chat at the end of the session. So we're delighted that we can now pivot to online and host this session virtually. Now with the wind in our sails, so to speak, following on from tremendously successful series that Aviva and Cody at Musqueam organized last summer, the Musqueam Archaeology Online series, and then the Indigenous Science Working Tools series that Andrew Martindale and Eric Simons organized and hosted this past fall. The Working Tools series actually got postponed twice, like once because of snow and then because of COVID. So anyway, we're catching up. We're finally getting all the things we had planned for last year kind of convened. So the seminar today, as I said, is a collaborative undertaking in every sense. The title, where did our belongings come from? Identifying long distance transport of obsidian across the Pacific Northwest based on Indigenous-led research initiatives. The presenters are going to be Dominique Weiss and Rye McMillan, affiliated with PCIGR, the Pacific Center for Isotopic and Geochemical Research, and Aviva Rathbone and Jason Woolman, who work with and for the Musqueam Indian Band as their senior archaeologist and archives and research manager, respectively. So a little bit more about each of them. I won't say much. I want the time to be devoted to their presentation. Dominique is the director of PCIGR, and she was one of the founding members, one of the founders of the Indigenous Science Cluster. She makes use of pretty highly technical trace element and isotope geochemistry, but with applications in a whole range of different areas, geological and environmental, from volcanoes. I love the volcanic stuff. Whenever a volcano blows up, I ask Dominique what's going on. That one in Hawaii last year was particularly striking because you were there just before it blew its top. But also there's the Bee Project. It's a matter of analyzing the isotopes and trace elements in honey all around the region in Vancouver to determine what kind of urban pollution bees are picking up as they forage. Just yesterday, we got news that Dominique has been honored with a university, that is UBC, Killam Professorship. She's one of 6 that was appointed this year, so there's a lot of hype online and positive thoughts and congratulations going in Dominique's direction. Rye combines training in geochemistry with longstanding immersion and training in archaeology, anthropological archaeology. And his primary commitment as a researcher is to build partnerships with Indigenous communities. So what he and Dominique will present today represents this collaborative approach to doing archaeology. Aviva is trained as an archaeologist. Aviva, who probably doesn't need introduction because she's run so many series and everybody in the world knows her. In any case, Aviva, I will introduce. In her role as senior archaeologist at Musqueam, she's like on the ground doing the business, demonstrating how archaeology can be transformed, how it can be done differently in highly productive ways by working with and for Musqueam to ensure respectful management and help to secure or advocate for sovereignty over Musqueam cultural heritage. And Jason, likewise, he's been working as the archives and research management for Musqueam since 2008. developing, promoting, putting to work the band's records in all kinds of ways. And it's interesting to read the website description of what all you do in your archives and research division or department. That sounds like you're putting band's records to work, for example, to meet internal information needs as they arise, and in support of Musqueam rights and title and rights, the work of that department of Musqueam. So those are our four presenters, the four presenters today. The plan is to start with each of them giving a brief account of the research, this collaborative research project. Then we've concocted some questions that may or may not be relevant to ask about how the partnership process, the collaborative process actually worked. For example, what does community-led research mean to the Musqueam and to the researchers involved in doing this collaborative work? What kinds of lessons have been learned? What kinds of projects are emerging? And then we'll open up discussion to everyone else. So that's all from me. I think you're starting, Dominique, and then like in the order that I introduce people. Yeah, there. Over to you.
I think it's me up first. Is it?
Apparently I can't unmute when I'm sharing my screen. Sorry, folks. There we go. Aviva knows I have problems with headphones and muting myself. Go for it.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm really excited to be here and excited to see lots of familiar faces and quite a few new faces, folks that I don't really recognize. So I'm really excited to talk to you a little bit about the history of this place that we now call Vancouver, but then to get into a little bit more specifically the research that we undertook with Rye and Dominique. And really thankful to Alec for opening us in a good way. I always really love Alec's openings. And yeah, just to really appreciate that, and to Allison, as always, for the very kind words. I will add to Allison's introduction that I think it's important for folks to know I'm non-Indigenous. I'm a settler colonialist. I am a settler colonialist, though, whose heritage is I'm Jewish, and that factors, I think, these days very heavily into the work I do and how I situate myself in this work, and also because I am part of the queer community, which I'm speaking about more now these days, because that helps contextualize the work I do too, the activism I do in my work, and just in the daily work that I do with Musqueam. But I am very, very, very lucky and fortunate to have the role that I do, and to be able to learn from folks like Alec and Leona Sparrow, who I'm sure folks know, and others who are constantly teaching me and educated. I am by no means an expert in Musqueam history. I am kind of a conduit who's here to speak about some of these things, but I'm also a placeholder. I spend most of my time building capacity within the nation and training Musqueam archaeologists, so that one day, hopefully not too distant future, there will be someone here from the community who's speaking about these things directly from their knowledge and their culture. And so I'm excited for when that day comes and I'm no longer needed. And we're working towards that. And this project is part of that as well, part of building capacity and working towards that. I am going to kick us off a little bit by kind of contextualizing some of the research we're talking about and talking about the history of this space that we call Vancouver. I'm going to, as best I can, situate you from a Musqueam perspective, and I'm also going to, I think all of us at some point will be using Hunkkaminam in our presentations. So you'll hear me refer to Musqueam, that is the name for Musqueam. Musqueam is the anglicized name, but we are now shifting back in writing and in speaking to referring to Musqueam by their proper name. You'll also hear us refer to the city of Cessnock And I really encourage folks to, when you're hearing these words, try them out at home. When you're speaking about Musqueam, to speak about Musqueam and not Musqueam. All of that really helps in language revitalization, which is also a part of what we do in heritage management. It's all connected. So many of us live and work on unceded Musqueam territory, though I think for those of us not in the archaeology world, we maybe don't have a fulsome understanding of the extent of that history, of the history of the landscape that we live on. And that really is, I'll be honest with you, a failing of those of us in heritage management, in archaeology. We have not been the best at communicating outwards some of the things that we are very privileged to learn. Some of that is on purpose for reasons of sensitivity and trying to keep access to very sensitive information. But some of that is we just we run in the same circles. We talk to other archaeologists, and we don't always stop to speak to the general public and to folks who maybe don't have the same understanding as we do. And so this presentation and the work with Ryan, Dominique is also part of, I think, my focus and Jason's focus these days, which is really to do that general public facing work, to do work that helps educate the general public, and in that helps to really situate people in the landscapes that they live and work on. So the city that we do call Vancouver now has been occupied for a very, very long time before it was named Vancouver, before it became the city that we know as Vancouver 150 years ago. And I'll start with this quote from the late Terry Point, who is an amazing archaeologist, which I like to situate us when he said that people often think of Vancouver as a new city, when in fact it's one of the most significant sites of ancient cultures in Canada, one that has even been compared to other societies such as the Egyptian and Roman societies. And it is a very, very old history of occupation here that goes back many times older, actually, than the pyramids, many millennia older than a lot of the monuments in Rome and those things that we think about being very ancient. And because the people of Musqueam have been living here for such a long time, they have a very extensive knowledge and understanding of their own history. They don't need, folks like me to tell them about their own history. They also have a very extensive knowledge and understanding of the landscape that they occupy. And that knowledge goes back many, many generations. There is lots of Musqueam documentation about things like the infilling of the Fraser Delta, which was starting about 8,000 years ago. And this knowledge far predates, Western scientific geological knowledge of the infilling of the Delta, which came hundreds and hundreds of years later. So we have that really extensive, long history, and I'm very, very lucky to have access to some of that history and to folks who know that history. And some of that history is public facing, it's accessible to the public. On the right here, this is a map of some of the Musqueam place names in Musqueam territory. These are places that Musqueam still does live and has lived in for a very long time. There are also places on the landscape that were utilized for other things, for resource gathering, for travel. There are places on the landscape that feature heavily in the culture and the oral histories. And we can see some of that occupation as well in the archaeological record, though the archaeological record is not particularly good at getting at that occupation as a whole. We can only see in the archaeological record those tangible things, those things that are left when people are living on the landscape, but we can't see all the other ways people were living on the landscape. And so archaeology that way is actually very limiting. We also, in archaeology, we tend to think about things, we classify them as archaeological sites, and then they're thought of as, places of the past, places people used in the past. And that's really a misclassification, because when we're talking about unceded First Nations history and territory, these are places that are still occupied. That occupation never ended. It's not a thing of the past. It still belongs to the people today, as it belonged to the people who were using it thousands of years ago. And at Musqueam, one of the ways that we're continuing to assert that continued occupation is in our use of certain terms. So throughout this presentation, you'll hear all of us refer to belongings or belonging. And that's a word that can be used to describe that projectile point that you're seeing on the screen now, or spearhead or arrowhead. But the term belonging often is what archaeologists have used to refer to artifacts. So in archaeology, we often talk about artifacts. And this term is really, what it does is it separates the living culture, the people who live now, from the people whose belongings those were. And so by using terms like belonging, we're reconnecting, we're creating those connections, and we're also, it's a political statement to reassert and reestablish sovereignty and control over heritage resources and care for those heritage resources, put that care back into those people whose belongings these still are. I will just read you a quick quote about belonging so you can hear it from Musqueam elder Larry Grant himself. And I love this quote because I think it speaks really clearly to why this term is so important in its use. He says, many times people are buried with things that are important to them or to the family that is putting away their loved ones. For that person to be in the other world, in the spiritual world, they need their belongings in order to use them. Those things belong to somebody. They didn't just appear in some pile of dirt. They belong to someone, and that's how it's always explained to us. And they still belong to people. They belong to the same people now who are the descendants of those people who made and used those belongings. And the descendants of the people, the Musqueam folks who occupy the landscape and the territory today, are the descendants of the people who lived in these places for thousands of years. And their ancestors were, they were lawyers, engineers, doctors. They built massive cities and maintained them for thousands of years. They had their own legal statutes and a comprehensive and in-depth understanding of their world that comes with living for thousands of years on a landscape. There's a number of stories at Musqueam of Musqueam having this knowledge about the landscape, about the sedimentation of the delta, about fish species and movement, and Western scientists coming to Musqueam territory and saying, oh, no, that can't be right. And then doing Western science and coming to the same conclusion. So that's, I think, really what this research cluster is focused on as well. We're never, using Western science to prove an oral history. Those oral histories are already proven. They need nothing else. But sometimes, like in the case of this research study, we do use Western science to add another lens, to add more detail in places where there might not be so much detail. And these cities that were occupied for thousands of years were never abandoned. People did move around from city to city. Populations changed. Populations were then decimated when smallpox was introduced. But there was never an abandoning of cities. That concept of places needing to be occupied by people continuously for periods of time in order for them to be occupied places is a Western concept, and is not a concept that's held by many cultures, and is definitely not a concept that's held by Musqueam, who still occupy the cities that they have occupied for thousands of years, even if they are not currently living there right now. And Cessnam is one of these cities that has been occupied for thousands of years and was once classified as abandoned. On the map there on the right, it's that writing in red that's furthest south. So the northernmost one is the city of Musqueam, which is where the Musqueam IR2 is right now. And then, yeah, further south from that, right at the south end of Granville Street, right where the Arthur Lang Bridge starts to go towards the airport, is the city of Cessnock. It's often referred to as Marpole. That's the neighborhood name, or you may hear it referred to in literature as the Great Fraser Midden or the Ebern Midden. Midden is an archaeological term that technically in German refers to a garbage heap, but we use it in archaeology in a specific context. But in the same vein as we don't use the word artifact, at Musqueam we don't use the word midden because these weren't garbage heaps. These were cities that housed thousands and thousands of people. From Musqueam's perspective on the city of Cessnock, I'll read you a quote. Our ancestors had many permanent villages and moved throughout our territory, but their main winter village was always located at the mouth of the Fraser River. 7,000 years ago, that village was Sequexin, which is also known as Glenrose in English. As the river delta grew and the mouth of the river moved, many of our ancestors moved with it. By 2,500 years ago, Cessnock was our largest village. It remained a major village until about 1,500 years ago, when with the changing delta, most people moved to join those of us already here at Musqueam. And interestingly, the trail that Musqueam would use to go between Cessnock and Musqueam, Musqueam IR2, later became what's now known as Southwest Marine Drive. So Southwest Marine Drive is built on a very, very old trail that was used by Musqueam ancestors for travel between those two cities. The area known as Cessnock now is extremely developed. It was one of the earlier areas in the city of Vancouver to become developed. It's where, if you've been down in that area, you might know where the Metro Theater is. There's a budget car rental, and then the approach to the Arthur Lang Bridge. So looks quite different these days than it would have thousands of years ago. You can go to the next slide, Rye. So I am going to take you through just a brief history of the place of Cessnock, but I am going to keep it brief so we can focus more on this specific research project and on the idea of collaborative practice. And then Andrew will at some point, I think at the end of this slide, I'll prompt you, Andrew. Andrew will provide folks with more resources to learn about Cessnock. And these are resources that either are in Musqueam's own voice or were produced in collaboration from Musqueam. So you can learn directly from them and not through me, which is how I and the community would prefer it. But the city of Cessnock does have a very, very long and at some points and still today, difficult history. It has been occupied by Musqueam since time immemorial. It's also recognized as one of the most important archaeological sites in BC, if not Canada. And in recognition of that, it is recognized as a National Historic Site. But despite all of this, oh, thank you, Andrew. Andrew popped some of the links down. Despite all of this, it has seen unprecedented destruction because of colonization and because of development as the city of Vancouver, as we know it, started to grow. We don't have pictures of the city of Cessnock, prior to the 1800s, but what we do have is we have lots and lots of information from the community, including, there are descendants at the community now of people who lived at Cessnock, and, folks in recent memory who remember going to Cessnock and seeing ancestors buried there. So I'll read you a couple of quotes directly from community members about the city of Cessnock. The first one is at Cessnock, we lived in family longhouses. We grew up surrounded by our grandparents, aunties, uncles, and cousins who provided us our snowyeth, or our teachings from childhood, and helped us come to our senses. Our families came together to govern this region. They are still strong, and their wisdom guides our community. Families were interconnected by marriage. These relationships created networks radiating up and down the coast and into the interior beyond borders. They were part of a sophisticated economy, which included long distance trade that kept resources flowing in and out of the territory. And this quote, I think, is particularly salient to the research project we're talking about today. But we also have other quotes from folks like James Point who remember seeing house posts and bones at the city of Cessnock in the 1880s. And then more recently, Chief Wendy Grant in the 1990s, in a letter to the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs, noted that the Musqueam Nation considers the Marpole Midden site to be one of the most meaningful storehouses of the history and culture of our people. So from those few quotes, we can at least glean a little bit the longstanding history of occupation and the importance of this place still to Musqueam peoples. The direct ancestors of today's Musqueam peoples who live here in Vancouver lived, died, and were buried at Cessnock. It is also recognized as one of the most important and extensive archaeological sites in Canada because of its size, time, depth, and also the extensive archaeological excavations that have taken place, and the information and resources that have been extracted as part of those excavations. There is an archaeological time period named after Cessnock called the Marpole phase. And as I spoke about before, it's a National Historic Site in recognition of its importance. But none of this prevented the extensive destruction that we've seen at this city, which started really with land preemption in the late 1800s, when George Garapy, an early settler, settled in this area. And shortly after, this area began to expand. There was construction of more facilities, a post office. Sea Island right across the river was established as a little post, and there began to be extensive development very early on in this part of the city. As kind of an interesting side note and related to this idea of continuity of place, George Garapy, though he was, an early settler colonialist and preempted this land, he did marry a Musqueam woman, and the city of Cessnock was still used seasonally well after it stopped being a permanent or winter village, with trails connecting Cessnock to Burrard Inlet, to other villages and other places where Musqueam was getting and using resources. But shortly after Garapy preempted the land, and we started to see this building, the Garapy Farm Road, which is a portion of road down in Marpole, was being upgraded, and during this upgrading in the late 1800s, ancestral remains were uncovered and were quickly removed and sent to the National History Museum, and were unfortunately later destroyed in a fire. But this was kind of the first look that the colonialists got at the richness, the archaeological richness and the historical richness of Cessnock, and unfortunately this richness ended up being Cessnock's undoing in a lot of ways. The photo on the left there with Harlan Smith from 1889 was one of the earliest archaeological excavations at this area. Harlan Smith, then working for Boaz, a famous ethnographer, removed 75 ancestors that we know of and countless belongings, and then was followed quickly by a number of other, I'll say archaeologists, but it was very early on in the study of archaeology. So followed by folks like Charles Hiltut, who was sponsored by the predecessor to the Museum of Vancouver, and Herman Liesk, who together removed countless ancestors, though according to Liesk's notes, we're thinking it's probably over 700 burials were removed from the site at this time, as well as belongings, and we still don't know how many belongings were removed. So many ancestors were removed at this point that many of them were discarded, and by discarded I mean in the trash. because of lack of museum space. And others were sent to the Royal College of Surgeons in London, which unfortunately was destroyed during World War II. And so a lot of that did not survive. But in 1938, Hiltude and colleagues succeeded in having the site designated a National Historical Monument, though unfortunately that didn't provide the city of Cessnock any further protection, though it is registered as one. And in the mid 1950s, Charles Borden, who is very well known as the father of Canadian archaeology and was a German professor at UBC, conducted salvage excavations at the archaeological site. And you can see a photo there on the bottom right. That's a photo he actually took of doing these salvage excavations when the Fraser Arms Hotel was first being built. So now the archaeological site, yes, thank you, Jason. And Andrew Charles, who was a Musqueam community member, worked very closely with Charles Borden. So the work that Charles Borden did at Cessnock really was a very early example of collaborative research. The two of them worked very closely together on this site and other sites in Musqueam territory. So the archaeological site that we can see now, which is not the totality of the city is much bigger and was much broader than the archaeological site. What's left now is probably much smaller, but the archaeological site is about 1.5 kilometers long. So it is massive. It dates back at least 4,000 years. So it's at least as old as the pyramids in Giza. But despite all of this, the history of destruction really didn't stop there in the 1950s, and we'll get into that in a second. But to learn more kind of about the connection to Musqueam, I really encourage folks to have a look at the resources Andrew dropped in the chat. What we put in there is, I really encourage folks to watch the Cessnock movie, The City Before the City, which was produced by Musqueam. And it's free and accessible on Knowledge Network. You just have to sign up for a free account. And it is an incredibly powerful and important movie, especially if you are, like me, one of the people who occupies this place that we now call Vancouver. There's also a book, These Mysterious People, written by Susan Roy, and she worked very closely and collaboratively with the community. And it is a very good, very accessible book. Musqueam also co-produced a teaching kit with UBC that speaks to some things like language. There's a really awesome video about the sedimentation of the Delta, and you can see that happening over time and can see the Musqueam cities. And there is also some really good language resources on there where you can hear the Hunkaminam orthographies. You can hear the letters. And I really encourage folks to click through those and to start familiarizing yourself with Hunkaminam, especially as we are going to see more places on the landscape being given back their ancestral and original names. And it would be awesome if you guys were, the first of your friend group or family to say, hey, I can read that. I know how to pronounce that. There's also the Musqueam website that has a lot of great information, and there is a place names map that I didn't give you, Andrew, sorry, but when it is someone else's turn to talk, I'll drop it in the chat. The place names map is also incredible because you can hear the pronunciation of some of the place names. So you can click over them and hear them being said, and that will help you maybe practice and so that you can utilize these place names. Oh, thank you, Daisy. Next slide, right? Yeah, so the area that we're talking about is kind of that map that's top left, that area that's shaded in red. It's made up of right now 4 different archaeological sites. So those sites all together make up what we know right at this moment is left in the ground of Cessnoom, though that is expanding all the time. We are finding new archaeological resources constantly and expanding the boundaries of Cessnoom. As the late Len Ham put it, it was the richness of the Marpole Midden which was its undoing. The Marpole Midden has seen extensive destruction over time because of, these archaeological excavations that went on, also because of the site was mined and the material was used to pave Southwest Marine Drive and likely other places in the city. And then the site has a very long history of being looted or pot hunted, as we refer to it in archaeology, and we'll get into it a little bit. Because up until the 60s, actually, it was a really popular weekend activity for families to go out and picnic at Cessnoom and loot the site for belongings. And that's actually a legacy that now is interestingly coming back around, where Jason and I are often contacted by the grown children of the people who were, the adults in the family who were doing this looting, who contact us from time to time and say, I have this belonging that has sat on my family's mantle for 40, 50 years. It was told to us it came from, the parking lot of the Fraser Arms Hotel, where our family used to go and picnic and would mine for belongings, but I feel uncomfortable holding on to it. Can I give it back? And we always welcome those opportunities as an opportunity to really thank those people for bringing the belongings home and to hold them up in a place of high regard. And then in the 1990s, Musqueam purchased some of the land where the Fraser Arm Hotel stands now, excluding the parking lot next to the hotel. And it was kind of around that time that BC's Heritage Conservation Act, also called the HCA, was finalized. I'm not going to get into it in this presentation. I have a whole other spiel about this, but this is the provincial legislation that is put in place to protect archaeological sites in BC, though that's kind of a misnomer, because archaeological sites in BC are destroyed and altered all the time legally under the Heritage Conservation Act. People just have to have a permit now in order to destroy or alter them. And this is colonialist legislation that is still administered by colonialist government by the BC Archaeology Branch. It's not legislation that is Musqueam legislation, and it's not legislation that we have very much say or control over. And this colonialist governing body, the BC Archaeology Branch, under colonialist legislation, did greenlight a condo development back in the early 2010 time period. I saw Leona hopped on here, so I'm hoping folks correct me if my time periods are wrong, because Leona was directly involved in this. And this was a condo development really in the heart of Cessnoom, right in what would have been downtown Cessnoom, where ancestors were buried. This condo development was greenlit despite the repeated and very vocal protests from Musqueam, who said many, many times to lots of different folks that that this was not okay, that the destruction of this city was not okay to make way for condominiums, and that the removal and unearthing of ancestors to make way for condominiums was also not okay. We wouldn't see it happen in Western colonialist cemeteries, like in the Fraser View Cemetery, so why is it happening in Indigenous cemeteries? And so during pre-construction archaeological investigations, a number of ancestors that Musqueam knew were there were unearthed by the archaeologists, and this kind of started a whole ball rolling, and as a result, I think it's changed the face of BC archaeology today. I don't know if folks remember back in 2012-ish, when there were protests and vigils in this area, and the Arthur Lang Bridge was closed at one point. But if you do remember that, then that's the incident I'm talking about. And I'm going to turn it actually over to Jason, who was part of that, was part of the original protest, was part of the events leading up to that. And so I think he can give us a really good understanding.
Yeah, I'll try to provide a little bit more context to that. So as Aviva had mentioned, we were notified during our office closure in December that work would be commencing at the arms or on those lots when we got back in January. So when we came back, there was communication to all levels of government to try to, and to the proponent to try to halt that work. That work wasn't halted. It moved ahead, and they, just as Aviva said, and as Musqueam had said all along, came across the intact remains of children and adults, and that was too much for the community to bear. So the community went down, and we were there for, I believe it was a couple of days at first. We were there, and all sides decided that, let's try to take a step back and see if we can come to some sort of resolution here. So everybody stepped back, construction stopped, the community went home, and there were discussions, and about 3 weeks or so went by, and there was no resolution to be had. The developer wanted to move ahead and exhume everything that was there and put in underground parking, and the community said, no, we can't abide by that. So the work resumed on the site, and the community went down en masse, and we were there for 212 days, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, always with, coffee, tea, and a little bit of food to share, and just wanting to inform people and answer questions. And it just, thinking back on how traumatic that is for people to look through that moduloc fencing at the exposed remains of their ancestors, and there's nothing they can do about it. So over the course of that 212 days, there were several days of action that we called them, and one of which was the closing down of the bridge. We went up to the Fraser View Cemetery as well, just to point out the hypocrisy of it all, that it's okay to destroy Indigenous burial grounds, but nobody would think of doing that. Nobody would think of developing a colonial cemetery. So the end result of that was that some of the permits were lapsed, and I don't know if others were rescinded. I can't recall, but the community ended up buying those lots back on their own, which, in and of itself is a bitter pill to swallow, to have to, put up your own funds that could have been put to better use, to go to education, to more development for housing, to all of these other things that the community could have done with those dollars, but instead had to do what should have been done before and protect those lots. So as Aviva mentioned, we did purchase those lots that were under threat of development in order to protect them. What happens out of that is a conversation with the community, and those discussions are underway.
Thanks for that, Jay. I will add that kind of, this was a really painful, and still is very painful, period of time, but it did really change the way that archaeology is practiced in BC. We in the discipline saw a massive shift following those protests. I am someone who came from the consulting world. I have been involved in projects similar to this one, and that's just kind of the way we operated. And when this happened and it garnered worldwide attention and it shut down development, I think us as a community really stopped and had to think about, what we were doing and why we were doing archaeology and who it was benefiting. And that started massive discussions that are still going on today. Discussions about, what the place is of archaeology and who should be controlling archaeology. These are really difficult discussions that are going to need to be carried on, especially now that DRIPA has been enacted, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And as we try and, put some of the DRIPA principles to action, some of which speak specifically about Musqueam's right to manage their own heritage, a right that they do not hold right now. Jason, you had something else?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add to an earlier point that you made, Aviva,
Mm.
that this did garner so much attention. And one of the things I just want to point out, and again, you touched on this as well, is that this happens all over the province, all over the world, all the time. Like, it's not unique to Cessna. Unfortunately, it happens all the time. But the only reason I feel that there was any uptick on this, any visibility, is because thousands of people have to pass by that site every day. So it was almost impossible to ignore. When you come in from the airport, you go by that site. All those people transiting in and out of Vancouver for work every day have to go by that site. If you take public transit, the depot is right there. So it was more, and we're in one of the most densely populated ecoregions in all of Canada. So it's so important. It's traumatic that the city developed on Musqueam's territory, and so much has been altered, and so much displacement has taken place. But that displacement is what gave way to the visibility to be able to have this conversation, and hopefully the conversations that continue to take place around projects like this. But I'm reminded that, on the heels of this, there was Grace Islet, and there was all these other instances that continue to take place that don't receive the same level of visibility and support simply because they're not in the public's eye. People can turn a blind eye to them.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jay. It's actually interesting. When I worked at, sometimes I am down there doing archaeology on behalf of the nation, and the general public will stop me and say, "What are you doing? This is an archaeological site. You can't be digging in there." And that I love it when that happens. It really only happens like one other place in the city. And it is amazing that folks know the history of that place and the importance. And then, following that, kind of in 2017, I believe it was, one of the last actions that Mayor Robertson took as mayor, when he was mayor, was to sell the parking lot of the Fraser Arms Hotel back to Musqueam for $1. So that took place a couple years ago, and it was really nice closure to, I think, this part of the chapter. The story is still very much ongoing. The story is still very much ongoing because we are still expanding the boundaries of the archaeological site, because Musqueam doesn't own all of the lots that the site covers and that the city occupies. Musqueam owns just a portion of the lots. And so we are actually constantly fighting similar developments all the time right now, the same as the one that took place in the development that took place in 2010-ish. And we are also right now, really, Jason and I do a lot to try and figure out where those ancestors and belongings are in the world. So many ancestors and belongings were taken from the site, and we still have not really a good understanding of where they're held. So we're working on that right now. We're also constantly fighting with researchers who are publishing works on Cessna without consulting or discussing with the nation. That's still ongoing, and is kind of a legacy of academia that I would really like to see the chapter of that end. But this project, I think, is a really important example of how we can move away from that, and how we can together create resources that are helpful and important to the community, and helpful and important to the general public. I think that's all I'm going to say there. So I'll pass it over to Ryan Dominique.
Awesome. Thanks, Aviva. That was simply remarkable. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And I've heard a few of those stories before, but that was so awesome. So I'm going to flip sides for Dominique here. I'm the one sharing my screen. So my apologies if anything's a bit laggy, but I'll leave it over to Dominique.
Thank you. Not sure I can make the jump, but I'll do my best. So Rai asked me to present what we can do and what kind of tools we have. And as you heard at the beginning, I'm a geologist. So I study rocks, and I mostly did that because I love nature and I love respecting nature and the environment. I've recently done way more, and I'm going to cover in about less than 10 minutes a few examples, big picture, mostly because over the 18 years that we've started working, or I've started working here in British Columbia, we picked various pieces of a puzzle. And what I'm meaning by that is you'll see that we studied the volcanoes. The volcanoes were useful to see the background in our honey study, the background composition in our honey studies, but were also useful for Rai to do his tracing with the obsidians. And it's pieces of a puzzle which probably and hopefully will come all together at the end of our combined talk. So, and I use a lot of analogies, so bear with me. A fingerprint is any unique or distinctive pattern that presents unambiguous evidence of a specific person or substance. Now, for planet Earth, we talk about geochemical fingerprinting. The distinctive pattern is the chemical composition, and the evidence is its age, source, or process. Planet Earth is, next slide please, is called the blue planet, as 2/3 are covered by the oceans, hiding the rocks below. Quite annoying for us. That's where our tools come into play. It is divided into different spheres, among which the mantle represents 84% of the total volume. It cannot be sampled directly, and the deepest we have drilled on Earth is only 12 kilometers. Next slide. An indirect way to probe the mantle, which is the original matrix from which everything else on Earth geologically differentiated, is through the study of basalts from mantle plumes, those magmatic features that bring material from the deep mantle 2,800 kilometers to the surface. And we study oceanic islands because they're not contaminated by continental crust. So the fingerprint of the source of these lavas is better preserved. Hawaii, next slide, is the best studied mantle plume with the highest magma flux. And you can see here Mauna Loa on the big island of Hawaii is the largest volcano on Earth, even taller than Mount Everest, starting from the bottom of the ocean. The Hawaiian mantle plume has been active and sampling the deep mantle for at least 85 million years, providing a record of its composition. Focusing on the island themselves, or the last 5.6 million years only, two distinct geographical trends of volcanoes, 50 kilometers apart, stand out. They also distinguish by their lead isotopes, which is the fingerprint of the source of the lava. The lower trend, in blue here, are more radiogenic. And in the next slide, we see that the origin of the difference between Loa and Kea trend volcanoes was very puzzling. For us, it troubled us. But we found out that, or we came with a hypothesis that the enriched geochemical difference of the Loa trend originate from sampling of two major seismic anomalous zones all the way down at the core mantle boundary. These anomalous zones contain some materials brought down into the mantle via subduction, as most of the geochemical heterogeneity is present in the deep mantle. Next slide. The subduction also generates melting and volcanic arcs, like the Garibaldi volcanic belt or the Cascade arcs, which is 1,300 kilometers long, extending from southwestern British Columbia all the way to northern California. Next slide. It has a north-south orientation, veering towards the west in Canada. And this is important. We have a change in geography that also corresponds to a change in isotopic composition. You can see here in red that the Garibaldi belt has different composition than the high Cascades, and you'll hear more from Rai about this. The cause of this difference is that the subduction plate is younger, hotter, and shallower in the north, in British Columbia, which has implication for the composition of magma and earthquake rates. Next slide. So I talk about contamination in lavas. Now we can also talk about contamination in the environment. And the geochemical fingerprinting can also trace the path and fate of metals in the environment. The visual impact of the landscape, like waste rock piles here, and settling ponds is obvious. But most of the elements that are released in the environment find their way into the ground, the water, the air, and ultimately the food we eat. Next slide. For instance, the oyster of the Pacific Northwest have very high cadmium contents, up to 2.6 microgram per gram, including those from pristine areas. And so a plate of 9 oysters corresponds to 3 times the recommended weekly intake with health and economic implication for anyone who is growing oysters. Next slide. We carried out a comparative study of the bivalves in BC and France. And our isotopic composition here indicate a natural sources for this high cadmium in BC coming through the Pacific seawater, while in France it reflects human pollution. Such heavy metals have long residence time in the environment. What I forgot to say is that these oysters are considered the best oysters in France. Next slide. So these lead isotopic compositions are one of the best tools to trace the source of pollutants. And recently we studied honey from hives in the greater Vancouver. Basically, the average honeybee works within a 3 kilometers radius. So the honey they produce is a perfect sampler of their environment and varies on a relatively small scale. And to do that, next slide, we paired with a non-profit organization working up the request. And we saw that the variation in the concentration and isotopic composition of lead among these honeys over 3 years are correlated with their location in Vancouver. We see patterns with other trace metals. Now, I have to emphasize that Hives for Humanity is producing honeys that are perfectly clean to eat. So that's just to set you the stage. Next slide. Our honey study led actually to more collaboration among people study bees, but also it was a big community effort. We created this research cluster, and actually this one came a year after the Indigenous Science Cluster. This one is called Beehive, for bee health impact and value in the environment. And it's exactly the same principles, next slide, than next animation than the Indigenous science. We're offering our tools, asking your questions and helping to resolve some question or precise them or whatever we can do. How do we do that? We have actually a series of instruments. We have, for instance, what we call clean laboratories, and I can expand why they clean if anybody is interested afterwards. The instrument below here is what Hai is going to talk about. Next slide. And give you an idea of what the space looks like. This big instrument here allows to measure very isotopes that are specific of the human body or biology. And I want to finish by saying we couldn't do any of that, next slide, with a unique team of young people, also older people, who love collaborating and who are very open to discussion, to help, and to be very friendly. Here you go, Hai.
Thank you very much, Dominique. And just going to point out how bright-eyed and bushy-tailed I looked in this photo. And it's so weird to see us standing close together in times of COVID. Boy, do I miss those times. So thanks for that, Dominique. That is an awesome stage to set. And I'm just going to carry on with a little bit of background about what the type of science, Western science, that we've applied in this context, and then get into the nitty-gritty of the project we worked on. So, and to reiterate again, what the Indigenous Science Research Cluster allowed us to do is we actually had funding to simply go and form partnerships first. And that was such a remarkable opportunity, not in just the ways of interacting with remarkable people, but also the research questions that came out of those discussions, those Indigenous-led questions, were way more fun and way more interesting to work on than anything I've certainly come up with myself. And we had conversations throughout that year with numerous Indigenous communities, and there was a very consistent theme that came up quite often, which were Indigenous-led inquiries into landscape use and resource acquisition. And that can be framed as a question of from where on the landscape did our ancestors collect resources? And those resources are highly variable in nature, of course. They can be foodstuffs and art stuffs and tool stuffs. And we're going to investigate a particular type of resource today that many of you are going to be familiar with. It's a natural volcanic glass, or obsidian in many cases. Or if you're a Game of Thrones fan, this is well known as dragon glass. I haven't seen that actually happen in person, but I'm sure that it does. So this material, as it was in the past, is still really valuable to humans today. If you compare a fractured edge of an obsidian flake, any piece, it can actually be as sharp as one molecule of silica. That's how thick that edge can be. So it's exceptionally clean cut. And if you compare that to a steel scalpel, the scalpel practically looks like a serrated saw under a microscope. And so even today in really sensitive surgery where there's a potential for scar tissue buildup to cause problems like eye surgery or tendon surgery, obsidian scalpels are still used. In addition to that, because of the nature of obsidian, it has really complicated internal structure, but there's no long range structure that breaks rather reproducibly, very reproducibly, and provides not only a very sharp edge, but a sharp edge that you can manufacture readily and quite straightforwardly. And serendipitously, for archaeologists, hidden inside this glassy matrix of obsidian belongings is a hint to the answer of the question, from where? Where did it originate on the landscape? And for over 50 years, since the 70s and before, archaeologists have been relying on numerous techniques, but quite often focusing on trace element concentrations of obsidian flows and their relationship to belongings in order to reattribute them back to their geologic sources. And trace elements are a fantastic proxy that they vary on the flow resolution. They can be measured non-destructively, but they do only provide one line of evidence. And that one solitary line of evidence can be a bit challenging when we have this geologic rule that doesn't state that they have to be unique. There's an assumption that trace element concentrations and characteristics are rather unique among different flows of obsidian, but there's no rule that states that, and there's no way to evaluate if we've actually investigated all possible sources. And using the scientific method, we're not actually able to reattribute positively an obsidian belonging back to its source, or any belonging back to its source. We have to reject hypotheses, not accept them, which means we have to disprove associations with so many different flows in order to have a high degree of confidence, especially if we're only using this one line of evidence. So prior to a lot of the engagement that I'm going to talk about later, we started exploring what other proxies, what other lines of evidence scientifically, Western scientifically, could we use to support the background of trace element concentrations that have been collected on all of these obsidian sources. So we explored another non-destructive technique called Raman spectroscopy. It's practically shooting a green laser pointer at things and seeing what light bounces back. And what it does is that green laser pointer shakes and vibrates all of the molecules in the belonging, especially in the glass. And those molecules respond back by sending certain types of light that will tell us their nature. And so in the spectra that you see here, there's actually quite strong differences in between different volcanoes that we've sampled for this. And you can also see just how complicated in all the different bumps in those spectra the internal structure of the obsidian is. So this is great because it's non-destructive, and every spectrum contains 1,500 data points that can be used in multivariate analyses. And then, as Dominique highlighted before, much more eloquently than I probably will do now, lead isotopes are the kind of big kahuna of sourcing in geological sciences. They are indeed the closest thing we have to a fingerprint of sourcing. And what we're talking about in terms of sourcing with lead isotope ratios is not to the individual flow. It's actually to the source of the magma that's produced out of that volcano. So the magma that eventually turns into the lava that's erupted onto the surface and quenched into obsidian. This is going to not trace those processes necessarily, but it's going to trace processes that are happening deep down inside the crustosphere and into the mantle, as Dominique described. So these are going to be much less variable within one volcanic complex and much more variable between volcanic complexes. And because of the subduction zone dynamics Dominique highlighted before, there is a systematic shift in how radiogenic, or how those three characteristics, how hot, how old, and I forget the last one, Dominique, I'm sorry, maybe you can chirp in. How hot, how old, and?
Or wet or dry.
How wet. Thank you. Yes, thank you. That changes as you go up and down the west coast of BC, and that causes this systematic bend between the High Cascades and Garibaldi Belt. And while this is useful within that context, when we expanded this northward into beyond the Garibaldi Belt into Anaheim Peak and Mount Adzaidza, we found that this trend actually was almost linear with latitude. What this permitted us to do is take a low-dimensional bivariate plot, like you see in the bottom corner there, containing the relative concentrations of three isotopes of lead as ratios, and we can actually draw a northward vector on it. If you give us a piece of obsidian and we have an inclination it's from BC, we can actually tell you approximately which latitude at which it erupted. Now, the value of that is we can exclude entire complicated volcanic complexes based on lead isotopes at the outset, which really greatly increases our confidence in using trace elements in the Raman response of belongings. The trouble is that as much as geochemists and we like to dissolve things, blow them up, ionize them, and shoot them through flight tubes towards detectors, this is not something that we want to do to valuable belongings. These are things that they're peoples, right? They're things that are important. And so for us, we had to balance in between collecting these different avenues of inquiry, so these different proxies, while maintaining the integrity of the belongings we're altering, but still collecting precise enough and accurate enough data. And to do that, we use the technique called laser ablation, ICP-MS, and which is something that's been used in geological sciences for a long time. That's basically taking a very high-powered laser, using it to do a pinprick or a laser prick, as I like to call it, in a belonging. And you take half of the material that you excavate, and it goes to one mass spectrometer measuring more precise and accurate trace element concentrations than spectroscopic approaches like XRF permit, and also collects that whole independent line of evidence in the context of lead isotopes. So this is one hole, two measurements. And when I say pinprick, it's actually the size of a pinprick. So if you look at this photomicrograph of a sewing needle I took, which was an interesting experience in itself, you can see that the very tip of it is about the same size as the little tiny holes within the blue circles. Those blue circles aren't the holes themselves, there's the little tiny spots inside. So it is destructive, it is removing material, but it is practically invisible to the naked eye. And because it's destructive, we still wouldn't want to do this on an entire assemblage unless it was necessary. So our workflow for applying our splitting obsidian procedure, it is a pretty nerdy pun. It's called split stream, LAICMS, and obsidian splits. I'm sorry for that. But we call it splitting obsidian because we take basically these samples, any samples, we analyze them with the non-destructive technique spectroscopically. We'll group them into categories, into groups, possible source locations, and then we'll analyze representative samples out of those groups with the minimally invasive technique to get lead isotopes. So that further reduces our impact on the archaeological record when we're dealing with larger assemblages. The interesting thing about this fantastic question, which came out of extensive discussions with Aviva and Jason and the crew, which is more specific to Musqueam and about lithic materials, is that the samples that we worked on, all of them were actually too small to be analyzed with portable X-ray fluorescence. So we had to work on a slightly different approach, which I'll highlight here. Just before I go into that, we call this obsidian among the beads. I'll tell you why in a little bit. But I want to congratulate my co-authors and everybody that worked with me on our AGU, or American Geophysical Union, Outstanding Student Presentation Award in 2019. It was super awesome to have our approach validated by such a large group of scientists. So thanks again, team, for helping out with that. And if anybody wants to investigate this in more detail, it is available in my UBC dissertation in geological sciences too. And echoing earlier sentiments of the same nature, I want to make it clear that the scientific findings I'm about to present here absolutely are not necessary and do not confirm oral histories. As Aviva put very eloquently, they're simply additional lines of evidence that may add some nuance or a slightly different perspective on something that was already well known through an alternate way of knowing. And the belongings that we're going to talk about today, we've coined a term called micro belongings, because I just think that's, first of all, quite adorable, and I think it is very descriptive. And we were working on a small assemblage of stone disc beads, actually. So something totally different, something made of fine grained material. We were trying to characterize those. And what we found mixed in with some of these stone disc beads were these little tiny fragments of obsidian debitage, or whatever they may be. And there were 14 pieces total. And you notice there are two color groups. We have D through G there, the tabular black pieces, which are glass. And then we have the clear, more translucent glasses. And then there's also I there, that larger chunk is a piece of fine grained material, which we won't talk too much about. But we were basically curious about why these look different, where they might have been. They were too small to analyze with PXRF. So we ended up asking, would Musqueam like us to poke them with the laser? And indeed, when we did so, we found that there was a striking difference between those black pieces of obsidian, that D through G, and the other clear, more translucent components. So if you look at the top panel, those group A, those gray, sorry, I'm having a hard time seeing. Those gray spectra are the group A belongings. And if you compare them to the sources in panel B, Mounted Zides at Anaheim Peak, Silver Throne, Mount Garibaldi, Glass Buttes, those which might be familiar, they are completely different. The group B belongings, those translucent ones, they do more match the more local volcanoes, but the group A's are completely different. And actually the main reason they're different is really cool. They actually have this vibrational stretching of iron oxide, that big peak you see in the very top set of spectra. And there's a small peak right under the label group A. And that's actually the spectral response of the mineral magnetite. So these obsidians actually have micro inclusions of magnetite. That's probably why they're opaque. And they respond to magnet and hand sample, which is also very cool. And so we were blown away that we had these glasses, natural glasses, and they didn't match anything from the local volcanoes we'd already explored. And so we started poking a little bit further, and we found that way down in southern Idaho, there was, lo and behold, another source with these magnetitic inclusions. And so, of course, this is still one line of evidence, even though we have 1,500 variables per spectra to use. So we started poking a little bit further with those variables. And this is a principal components analysis run literally on the entirety of the Raman spectra. And you can see, instead of qualitatively kind of matching those spectra together, we've been able here to more quantitatively predict that the diamond markers, which are those group A magnetic belongings, are super different than the other obsidian Raman responses that we'd collected from the High Cascades, Garibaldi Belt, and north. And those group B belongings sat, again, right on top of most of the Garibaldi Belt stuff. So with that super interesting possibility that these could be really exotic, we brought that information to the community and said, hey, would you be interested in us doing some laser pricks in these sample and seeing and collecting trace elements and lead isotopes? And because of their small size, it was something that I think was really easy to justify. We got all of this additional information, and they're very small fragments. And because we did split stream and we simultaneously collected lead and trace elements, we were able to start with the lead isotopes, start with the widest geographic resolution and work in. And if you take a look at the plot on the left of the screen, those diamond markers are the group A magnetic obsidians, the white ones, and the circle white markers, clear markers, are the group B. And I actually thought the group A obsidians were a QA/QC problem when I first looked at it. They were so different from any of the other obsidians we'd worked on. I had a small panic, did all of my checks, and indeed, they are the accurate results as far as we could collect. And when we compared them to rhyolites from the Browns Bench area, so the exact same location just hadn't been quenched into glass, we found that the lead isotope composition of Browns Bench, in addition to the Raman matching, also could not be excluded for the group A belongings based on the lead isotopes. And then if you look at the group B obsidians, it's a similar story as the Raman. It's a little bit messy within the context of the high Cascades and the Garibaldi belt, but it then goes to show the consistency between these two approaches. So now moving from the volcano resolution to the flow resolution, we can do really intensive examinations of condensed high dimensionality plots as much as possible. So here you can see this is a 2 trace element ratio. So there's a characteristics of 4 trace elements in this plot. Just for reference, the background that we're comparing this to, there is 1,430 source observations. All of the ones that are in black outlined are ones that we collected, and the others are from literature sources or from other labs. And it's the same story here. Again, we have the diamond markers aligning with Brown Bench. That's the group A obsidians. And the circle marker is aligning now, in this case, a little bit more specific to Obsidian Cliffs, Newberry Volcano, and Glass Buttes, which you can see on the map are all situated in Oregon. And so if we compare this to a concentration plot, just for some folks who might be more comfortable with this, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the notation, microgram per gram is the more geochemically correct way to say parts per million, just because we're measuring the weights of things, not necessarily the actual counts of things. So this is parts per million plots, if you're comfortable with that. And you can see it's the same type of outcome. We have the Browns Bench source directly below the group A obsidians, with the group B obsidians, the micro belongings sitting on top of Glass Buttes, and tucked right in below is Obsidian Cliffs. And just note that the Garibaldi stuff that you see in the bottom left corner, it's just sitting there because Garibaldi is extremely low in trace element concentrations, and that's probably where the wash comes from in the plot on the left as well. I can change. And then the same thing with niobium and yttrium, and it's the same basic outcomes. So as somebody who's pretty nerdy about statistics, I'm not really comfortable just eyeballing things like this. So what we've done is we've taken 5 different trace element concentrations for all of the different sources, and we've built a linear discriminant model. So it's called linear discriminant analysis, and basically what it allows you to do is build a model that is condensing these 5 variables into a few, and then using that model to put samples of some type into it, and then you get probabilities of affiliations with different sources in a very robust way. And so to show how robust this sourcing framework was, what we do is we build a kind of a sub-model with 80% of the data set. So that's 80% of 1,430. We take the other 20% and we see how well the model puts that 20% back in. And this model that we've built is performing so well that it's actually putting 96% of that 20%, that test set, back into the model accurately. So therefore, we can trust, to some degree, the posterior probabilities, the outcomes, in a more confident way. And for those of you that might be more comfortable with PCA, I know that's kind of common to do in sourcing. I have a little nerdy thing I, again, want to show you. So the difference between LDA and PCA, besides some of the mathematical components, is that LDA is predictive and it's supervised, which means it has priors of the groups. We've told it that there is all these observations from Anaheim, all of these from Bear Gulch, all of these from Obsidian Cliffs. And it tries to separate out the groups to build the model. What PCA does is it's meant for exploratory approaches. It's unsupervised, so it just tries to expand the whole data set out as much as possible. And if your supervision on your LDA is performing well, what happens is a completely unsupervised PCA, if I switch the axis and rotate it orthogonally, you can see that it almost produces the exact same model, but the LDA separates out the groups slightly better. So these aren't super different things, but the value of the LDA, the predictive aspect, is that we can do things like this, which is showing the probabilities of affiliations for each belonging. So the micro belongings are all along the x-axis. The posterior probability of belonging to a particular source is on the y-axis. And for group A, you can see that Brown's Bench, which is the gray line, there's almost 100% likelihood that those 4 microbelongings originated from that source within this model and based on the trace elements we've used. And then for the group B, as you saw in the plots, it's a bit of a mix. There's a shared probability between glass buttes and obsidian cliffs. And because we're not positively attributing things, we suggest that we can't exclude either of those sources for those belongings. What this allows us to do is draw some pretty long lines that were already known, of course, but long lines of these really tiny, beautiful micro-belongings extending as the crow flies over 1,000 kilometers from Musqueam down to Brown's Bench. And depending on which belonging you're talking about, over 670 and 550 kilometers to glass buttes and obsidian cliffs. So in collaboration with Indigenous science and oral history, by having these conversations and taking this approach, we've shown that Western scientific analyses can provide additional lines of evidence for long distance trade and exchange in antiquity. And I think I'll leave the last snippet to Aviva here.
Aviva and Jason, thank you for that, Ryan.
And Jason, of course. You're welcome. Thank you.
I always love hearing about that and feel like I understand just a tiny little bit more every time you talk about it. Yeah, so the importance of research like this to Musqueam really is, as we've talked about a number of times, we're not giving them any new information that they didn't already know. But the importance lies in a couple of different things. The first is, this collaborative nature of the work that we did. So this bringing together, Musqueam and Musqueam's questions with science, Western science and Western scientific techniques and tools like the tools that Dominique and Rai use. It also, and I'm really proud of this, this type of collaboration exposes some scientists who don't often work with Indigenous populations to, the concept of, the peopling of this landscape we occupy, and also to the idea of what their tools can be used for. This research really came out of Jason and I, this is not our research question, Jason and I in an open house to the community, kind of asked the community what they would like to look into, what types of analyses they would like to do. And we were really surprised at folks' answers in that folks were open to doing these minimally invasive or destructive techniques because they want to see these types of details that they already know exist. I know Morgan is on here, Morgan Guerin, and so he's also texting me because I'm remembering, bringing these results to him and saying, "Oh my God, Morgan, we're finding obsidians from Brown's Bench," and him saying, "Yep, those are our cousins down there, of course." Yeah. So again, I love those moments. I really love those moments. But instead, what we're doing is we're able to, engage the community in a different way, bring the community into these Western scientific techniques. And that picture down there is a picture of Rai when he brought the PXRF to the community and was showing folks how to use the PXRF. And we're also working with Rai now on training community members to do these types of analyses so that, Musqueam can do this themselves if that's what they want in the future. These types of analyses are also important for sites like Musqueam, where we have just seen so much removed from the site, and we're not interested in removing anymore, but we are interested in seeing, what kind of picture we can paint with what has been removed from the site. And then lastly, all of this evidence is often used in title and rights cases to, unfortunately, where, the Western court system rely on Western scientific evidence very, very strongly still. We often have to bring lines of evidence like this to show not just the time depth of landscape use, but the extent across areas and territories. What this technique does not get at is a couple of, key questions. So questions like, why take materials from Brown's Bench when there are much, much closer resources to use and easier resources to use? or questions like how was the trade of obsidian, how was that negotiated between groups, between families? And often Western science, because we can't get at that information, we don't publish on those nuances, and those important pieces are lost, and their loss has an implication to title and rights cases as well, when folks are missing that information about, you know, the Musqueam laws that governed how resources were accessed and traded across long distances. Jason, I'm sure you have stuff to add there. We nerd out about this stuff constantly.
Yeah, I mean, before I went too much further, I just wanted to acknowledge, I believe Leona Sparrow is here, and Sue Raleigh, and others. And I just wanted to say that, you know, just like we talk about like the history of the relationship between archaeology and communities, how that's evolving, like it's also the story of relationships. And, you know, we wouldn't be having these conversations at the table the way we're having them if folks like, you know, Leona and others weren't there, like pushing those envelopes and opening those doors and creating the space to be able to have those conversations. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And then when it comes to the testing, as Aviva mentioned, like we had an open house and we were talking about a whole bunch of different things. Like we were trying to talk about like repatriation and what does that mean? Like when we say repatriation, because, you know, it's not just the belongings, but there's soil samples, there's records that go with those things, there's all sorts of stuff. So we were trying to talk about like, you know, what the focus should be generally. And when we were talking about the different types of analysis, you know, when it comes to relationships, I know even relatively recently in the last number of years, like the community hasn't been overly open to some of those forms of research because we weren't really a part of the process. There was no agency for Musqueam in that scenario. We were just furthering the research needs of others. And you know, as we start to get into more collaborative, like mutually respectful relationships like this, it has made people feel, in my opinion, much more comfortable, and to the point where they're like, well, not just that, but can we also do X, Y, and Z? You know, and I was really surprised when we had that open house, how receptive, how open, and how eager people were to engage in this type of research across the board. You know, it wasn't just you know, our youth or a couple of others, but you know, across the spectrum there of community members. And so I thought that was really important, but I also just want to say that it's also, it's an evolving conversation. It's not just like a carte blanche approval to do projects like this, but that's, again, when we have a relationship, we can have a conversation. And I think that's what's important, is what we've created is a relationship here where we can have these conversations, we can pose those questions. It's okay to step back. It's okay to take time. And that's what's important for the community, is that level of respect, because we often get put in a position where we're under the behest, under the timeframes of others. And I think part of this process that's been so valuable for us is that level of respect, and that it is a relationship that we've created here. And it's not an extractive process, but a collaborative process. So I want to raise my hands to the team for that as well.
Thanks for that, Jay.
Well, wow, thank you. Thank you all. We're at the end of the planned session. So those who need to go just definitely do. But if you presenters are willing to hang out for a little bit longer, maybe we could take questions from